He will not force
Okay, good afternoon. This is the fourth out of 5 lectures I'm going to deliver here as a Weidenfeld visiting professor. I'm not going to say that this fourth lecture is the most important lecture of all, but I would say that this is the center of the 5 lectures. So the three previous ones have been sort of preparing this one, and that's why this lecture is called The Blind Spot, which would be the same title as the book in which I'm going to rewrite all these five lectures. And it's going to be published in Spain, I hope, in October or something like that. Okay. My latest novel to be published in English is called Outlaws and revolves around the vicissitudes of a fictitious gang of juvenile delinquents in late 1970s in Spain, Cercas gang. If I had to sum up its plot, I would say it tells the story of a love triangle that lasts for almost 30 decades. Almost 30 years. A triangle formed by Zarco himself, the group's leader, who in time ends up turning into a myth of juvenile delinquency, by Gafitas, a bespectacled middle-class teenager who joins the gang in the middle of the summer of 78, and finally by Tere, the character who, in my opinion, embodies all the book's moral dilemmas and keeps all its secrets. That's how I usually describe the novel. But Carlos Marzal, in my opinion the best Spanish poet of my generation, has described it as an existential thriller, as a thriller that doesn't just pose an almost police procedural question and try to resolve it, who squealed on Zarco's gang, but rather, in setting out this problem and attempting to find a resolution to it, involves existential questions that decisively affect the destiny of the protagonists. Marzal's description strikes me as exact, especially if we immediately add that, as well as an existential thriller, Outlaws is also an anti-thriller. Because contrary to what tends to happen at the end of thrillers, at the end of Outlaws, the answer to the question the book poses is that there is no answer. In the end, we don't know who informed on Zarco's gang. We don't know whether Tere informed on purpose, if she couldn't take the police pressure and wanted to save Gafitas, or if Gafitas or Zarco himself came away by accident, or even if some other member or acquaintance of the gang may have squealed. In the very center of the novel, there is, therefore, an unanswerable question, an unresolved enigma, a blind spot, a place through which, in theory, the reader sees nothing. The truth is, in practice, the profound significance of the whole novel is situated right there, and it is precisely through this blindness that the novel sees. It is precisely through this silence that the novel is eloquent, or should be. It is precisely through this obscurity that the novel illuminates, or should illuminate. This paradox not only defines Outlaws, it defines all or almost all my novels. The narrative mechanism that governs them is deep down similar. At some moment of its unfolding, a question is posed, and the rest of the novel consists, in a more or less visible or secret way, of an attempt to answer that question, until finally the answer is that there is no answer. At the end of The Anatomy of a Moment, my previous book in English, we don't know exactly why, on the 23rd of February 1981, Adolfo Suárez, the architect of transition from dictatorship to democracy in Spain during the 70s, remained sitting on his presidential bench in the Congress of Deputies, while the golpistas' bullets whizzed around him, and all, or almost all, the rest of the parliamentarians sought refuge under their seats. And we don't know it, and we don't know in spite of the whole book being nothing more than an attempt to find that out. At the end of Soldiers of Salamis, perhaps my best known book, we don't know exactly why, in the dying days of the Spanish Civil War, a Republican soldier spared the life of Rafael Sánchez Mazas, poet, fascist ideologue, and future minister in Franco's first government, who was trying to hide in the woods after a miraculous escape from a collective firing squad. And we don't know, in spite of the fact that throughout the whole book, the journalist, who is the protagonist, does nothing but try to answer that question. There is no answer to it, just as there is no answer to the question of the anatomy of a moment. Just like in Outlaws, the answer is the quest for an answer, the question itself, the book itself. Or, to put it in other words, none of these novels gives a clear, specific, and unequivocal answer to its central question, but just an ambiguous, equivocal, contradictory, essentially ironic answer. An answer that in fact is not an answer, and that, however, is the only kind of answer a novel can allow itself to give, because the novel is the genre of questions, not the genre of answers. Strictly speaking, the novel's obligation is not to answer the question it poses, but to formulate it in the most complex way possible. I'm talking about good novels, of course, or good novels of modern times, or the kind of modern novels that I like or seem best to me. Because it's not just my novels that operate in the way I just described. Actually, there are many important novels, maybe an entire tradition of novels that also do, since all of them hold at their heart a blind spot which rules their operation. We could call them blind spot novels. Let's take, for a start, the first modern novel, probably the best, or in my opinion, the best. In any case, the one that contains the source of all the future possibilities of the genre, and that precisely due to its foundational character determines, to a great extent, its future. The central question that Cervantes poses in Don Quixote is clear. Is Don Quixote crazy or not? At least for a start, the answer to this question is no less clear. Don Quixote undoubtedly is crazy. Of course, we could disagree on the type of madness our knight suffers from, and there's been no shortage of doctors who have ventured clinical diagnosis of his illness. Surely a futile, if not improper effort. After all, Don Quixote is not a person of flesh and blood, although he often seemed like one, but an invented character. And as a consequence, as the psychiatrist Carlos Castillo del Pino says, his madness should not be taken in a medical sense, but as a fictional construction, he says. It doesn't matter. What is certain is that Don Quixote is crazy, completely crazy, stark raving mad. It is also certain, nevertheless, that Don Quixote is sane, totally sane, as the perplexed character who cross paths with him notices time and again, when they hear him reflect with perfect lucidity on any subject, as long as it's not novel chivalry, of course. So, which is it? Is Don Quixote mad, or isn't he? We don't know. Or if you prefer, Don Quixote is both mad and sane. This contradiction, this irony, this essential, irreducible ambiguity constitutes the blind spot of Don Quixote. But it's precisely through this blind spot through which Cervantes' novel says all that it has to say, which is not, of course, that truth is a question of perspective, as has been repeated so often, or that, as Leo Spitzer wrote, reality, says Spitzer, is susceptible to various interpretations. No, what Cervantes is really saying, thanks to the blind spot of Don Quixote, is that truth, especially human truth, which is what most interests him, is essentially ambiguous, ironic, and contradictory. That Don Quixote is mad, but he is also sane. That Don Quixote is a comic and grotesque character, but also an admirable character, a tragic hero. And that all the rest of the characters in the book share the protagonist's duplicity, and even the book itself shares it. It is, of course, the book an invective against the books of chivalry, as you remember Cervantes says at the beginning in the prologue of the first part. Yes, it is that, but it's also a homage to books of chivalry, and the best of them all. Right there, the essential nature of Don Quixote is revealed. Its deepest truth, its absolute genius, which is in its capacity to create a radically ironic world. A world where monolithic truths, not subjects to appeal, don't exist, but where all truths are forked, ambiguous, polyhedric, iridescent, and contradictory. This is the characteristic world of the novel, not just of Don Quixote, but also of the novel as a genre, at least the best novels or the ones that matter most to me, the ones that carry on the legacy of Cervantes. This tradition thoroughly inherits the Spanish writer's ironic vision of the world, his anti-dogmatism, the skepticism and tolerance that this entails, which is why it is as essential, or more essential, as the development of science to the triumph of modernity. This tradition also inherits, at least in some basic cases, the ideal instrument to position irony in the very center of the novel, the blind spot. Let's take, for example, a novel in every respect almost as great as Don Quixote, very different from Don Quixote, and at the same time inconceivable without it. Let's take Moby Dick. The central question of Melville's novel is also clear. Who is Moby Dick? Why is Ahab obsessed with the white whale? What does that unusual and delusional cetacean represent for the captain of the Pequod? It's not a clinical or apparently clinical question like that of Don Quixote, but a moral or metaphysical one. However, just like that of Don Quixote, the preliminary answer is obvious. I quote now A.M. Foster. Foster says, "Narrowed and hardened into words, the spiritual theme of Moby Dick is as follows: the battle against evil conducted too long or in the wrong way." End of quote. So then, the white whale is the incarnation of evil and represents for Ahab, as Melville says, now Melville, all the subtle demonisms of life and thought. This is all true, in my opinion, but it's also entirely insufficient. Foster himself knows it, and that's why he adds rather hazily, quote again, "The essential in Moby Dick," says Foster, "its prophetic song flows outward the action and the surface morality like an undercurrent. It lies outside words." End of quote. Foster feels that his description of the novel is poor and partial, but he can manage to explain why, and therefore concludes with resignation. Again, quote, "Moby Dick is full of meanings. Its meaning is a different problem. Nothing can be stated about Moby Dick except that it's a contest. The rest is song." End of quote. It's not true. It's not true. Foster is mistaken. Something can certainly be stated about Moby Dick, and it's not just song. What can be stated is that, as well as incarnating evil, Moby Dick incarnates good, and that in this perfect contradiction, in that unsalvageable irony, in that blind spot, the book's entire meaning begins. It's true that Ahab is a sort of holy knight-errant who embarks on the impossible endeavor of destroying the devil, personified by the white whale. But we mustn't forget that for Melville, whiteness is also the sign of a certain mystical presence. Again, Melville, the most meaningful symbol of spiritual things, nay, the very veil of Christian deity. End of quote. and that the white whale appears as a grandiose mythical representation of all that's divine. What's more, on occasion, the narrator speaks of him as an archangel, in such a way that Ahab's struggle against Moby Dick ends up being identified with Jacob's wrestling with the angel, with the biblical episode Melville alludes to explicitly, for example, at the end of chapter 123. No doubt about it, Moby Dick is evil, but he's also good, and he's God, but he's also the devil. In the same way, Ahab is a great titan who does not back down in his battle against Moby Dick, as Jacob does not back down in his battle against the angel until he obtains his blessing and could at last say. Genesis 32:30 says Jacob, I have seen God face to face, and my soul was set free. Ahab is a titan, but also sick with hatred, and he is a free man, but also a slave to his obsession with Moby Dick. As with everything in Don Quixote, everything in Moby Dick lives on the exact edge of permanent contradiction, of permanent ambiguity. Like Cervantes in Don Quixote, Melville formulates the question he poses Moby Dick in the most complex way possible, and that maximum complexity is the answer to his question. The answer is the quest for an answer, the question itself, the book itself. That's why Maurice Blanchot states that Melville's novel, this is Blanchot, keeps the ironic character of an enigma that only reveals itself by the question it proposes. End of quote. Something very similar could be said of some of Franz Kafka's novels and stories. Perhaps it appears more clearly in The Trial than in any of the others. The nuclear question of this novel can be deduced from its magisterial opening, famous opening, right? Quote, someone must have been telling lies about Joseph K., for without having done anything wrong, he was arrested one fine morning. End of quote. The question is automatic. How is it possible for Joseph K. to be arrested if he really hasn't done anything wrong? Or is it not true that he hasn't done anything wrong and the truth is that no one has been telling lies about him? What is Joseph K. accused of? And most of all, is he guilty or innocent? From the moment when, at the beginning of the novel, he is arrested by some guards at the boarding house where he lives, Joseph K. invests most of his energy in trying to answer these questions, until exactly 1 year later, at the end of the novel, two semi-mute, insensitive men lead him with repugnant formality through the night to a desolate and deserted quarry and kill him without his ever having seen the judge or court that has accused him, without even having found out what he's been accused of. Joseph K., no doubt about it, is innocent, at least in theory, because as the narrator makes clear, he lives in a state of law. And as we know, in a state of law, everyone is innocent until proven guilty. But is Joseph K. also innocent in practice? Somewhere, George Steiner encapsulated Kafka's worldview in a scene from Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven film. The town sheriff, played by Gene Hackman, has beaten up a man, Eastwood himself, a group of prostitutes had hired as a gunslinger. Scandalized, the prostitutes reproach the sheriff for his beating, telling him his victim was innocent. Innocent of what? The sheriff replies. Innocent of what? That's, in fact, just how Kafka's world works, especially in The Trial. It's not a world ruled by law, as the narrator believes, but a world as wild as the Wild West, a world where everyone is guilty until they can prove otherwise, and proving that is impossible. What is Joseph K. accused of? Is he innocent or guilty? We don't know. There is no clear and unequivocal answer to that question. The answer again, is the quest for an answer, the question itself, the book itself. That is, it's an ambiguous, contradictory, essentially ironic answer. Joseph K. is innocent. No one knows what he's accused of, or even who is accusing him. But at the same time, he's guilty, because nobody in Kafka's world is free of guilt. And that's why, at the end of the novel, while his two executioners pass the knife they are about to use to murder him back and forth amid nauseating courtesies, the protagonist, Joseph K., now accused of his own guilt, feels that, quote, he was supposed to seize the knife himself as it traveled from hand to hand above him and plunged it into his own breast, end of quote. Kafka thus manages, through the ignorance in which the trial's blind spot keeps the reader, to express with all its subtle richness the monstrous character of his fiction's universe, a universe where it's possible to be, at the same time, innocent and guilty, or where innocence does not exempt one from either guilt or the atrocious destiny reserved for the guilty. The ignorance of the blind spot, its not knowing, is a wise ignorance. Its darkness, its not seeing, a darkness that illuminates. Its silence, it's not saying, or it's not saying in a clear and an undeniable way, but ironically or paradoxically, an eloquent silence. I've mentioned Kafka's stories in passing, but with good reason, as well as some key novels such as the one I've just been discussing. Some fundamental stories by fundamental authors are ruled by a blind spot in the same way or similar way. I'm thinking, for example, of 4 short stories by 3 writers previous to Kafka, whose work Kafka influenced. Something that should not surprise us. Every great writer provokes such a shake-up in the tradition that, according to what Borges wrote following Eliot, the essay by Eliot, the tradition and the individual talent, writes Borges, his work of this great writer modifies our perception of the past, as it will modify the future. End of quote. Maybe the most Kafkaesque of those precursors of Kafka's might indeed be Melville, Herman Melville, to the extent that it's quite possible that only thanks to Kafka have we begun to understand him entirely. Perhaps it's not coincidence that Melville was not considered the colossal writer he is until the 3rd decade of the 20th century, when Kafka's universal prestige began after his death. Be that as it may, Bartleby the Scrivener and Billy Budd Sailor are dazzling Kafkaesque tales with blind spots penned by Melville. The first narrates the story of an enigmatic scrivener whose enigmatic motto is, "I would prefer not to," and we'll know whether he's an incarnation of pure passivity or of pure rebellion. In the second, in Billy Budd Sailor, Melville revives toward the end of his life, through the story of the sacrifice of an innocent sailor, the theme of Moby Dick, the struggle between good and evil, between God and the devil. All the stories with blind spots that evoke Kafka are Wakefield by Nathaniel Hawthorne, the very man Melville dedicated Moby Dick to, or Joseph Conrad's The Duel. The first tells Hawthorne's story, tells the story of a happily married man who one day, for no apparent reason, abandons his wife and for the next 20 years lives in the next street over from her and their home, alone, unbeknownst to her and everyone else. And in the second, Conrad narrates the indefatigable and inexplicable deadly animosity between Ferraud and Dubert, two cavalry officers in Napoleon's Grand Army. It's perhaps worth saying that the blind spots of Don Quixote, Moby Dick, Bartleby the Scrivener, and Wakefield are, shall we say, conceptual blind spots. Don Quixote, Moby Dick, Bartleby, and Wakefield represent insoluble enigmas, extreme living contradictions, profound itinerant ironies. The blind spots of the trial, Billy Budd Sailor, and the duel, on the other hand, are narrative blind spots, shall we say. Blind spots provoked by hiding an essential piece of information. The charges against Joseph K., the origin of the hatred that sends a Billy Budd to his death, or the lifelong enmity between Ferrot and Dubert. There are two extraordinary tales, apparently very different but secretly similar, which also contain narrative blind spots. The Turn of the Screw by Henry James and The South by Jorge Luis Borges. In the first, it's impossible to know whether the malevolent spirits that bedevil the angelic children really exist in the blind mansion, or if those ghosts are nothing more than the new governess's recurring hallucination, inventions or projections of her hysteria. In a similar way, in the second, it's impossible to know if Juan Dalman, the librarian enamored of the violent and romantic South of his ancestors, dies in an absurd knife fight with a gaucho, or if he dies in the humiliating and prosaic hell of a hospital bed, while dreaming of a honorable death out on the pampas in broad daylight in a knife fight. Both interpretations of both these stories are correct, although contradictory, just as it's correct to say that Don Quixote is mad and at the same time sane, or that Moby Dick is good and at the same time is evil. The essential irony of the blind spot does not subtract, it adds. As Thomas Mann observed, irony does not consist of saying neither this nor that, but this and that at once. Furthermore, it's easy to imagine that, aside from novels or short stories, there are works in other genres governed by the blind spot. Plays, for example. What else but a giant blind spot is the absent protagonist expected in vain in Waiting for Godot? In any case, it's very possible, as I indicated at the beginning, that the novel might be the genre of narrative most inclined to the blind spot, the genre that best handles or that most demands it, given that it's found at the very origin of the genre, or of one particular tradition of the genre, the one initiated by Cervantes, in which irony occupies a determining position. The fact is that it is not easy to come up with examples of realist novels with blind spots. The reason, perhaps, is that this tradition of the novel, the realist tradition, as it took shape in the 19th century, encourages, before all else, the impossible ambition to create a novel similar to a hermetically sealed world, a replica or a duplicate of the real one, while in a novel, the blind spot is a crack, a vanishing point of meaning that is at the same time the principal source of meaning. This might explain why, in the few realist novels with blind spot that occurred to me, the blind spot is there as if against the author's will, without the author seeming to have sought it, or without being entirely aware of it. I'll give a couple of examples. Perhaps significantly, these two examples, these are two novels by authors who, although wanting to be faithful to realism, are writing at a time when realism has been in crisis for quite some time. The first example is, of course, The Time of the Hero, La Ciudad y los Perros, by Mario Vargas Llosa, a novel whose original publication in 1963, as I mentioned in my previous lecture, marked the symbolic start in Latin America of an explosion of creativity that brought Spanish narrative back to a position in the Western literary tradition which hadn't occupied since Cervantes. I also explained then that this novel, heir in equal measure to both Flaubert and Faulkner, revolves around the murder of a teenager nicknamed the Slave in a military academy in the Lima of the early 1950s. But I saved a very revealing anecdote for today. Apparently, when the French translation was published, the French translation of the book was published, Roger Collois, the French critic, the French writer, asked Vargas Llosa who, in his opinion, had killed the Slave. This, naturally, as you remember, is the crucial question of the book. And Vargas Llosa answered saying that he thought he'd been killed by one of his classmates, the one nicknamed the Jaguar. "No!" Collois shouted indignantly. "You don't know who killed the Slave," he told Vargas Llosa, Collois. Of course, Collois was right. In the first place, because no matter what the author might say, with the novel in hand, there are just as many reasons to back up the theory that the Jaguar killed the Slave as there are to refute it. We saw it in the previous lecture. And in the second place, and most of all, because Collois understood that if Vargas Llosa had cleared up the ambiguity by making it clear that the Jaguar had really killed the Slave, the novel would be a good novel. But without clearing up the ambiguity is much better. As I tried to show in my last lecture, its blind spot is what gives the time of the hero its extraordinary complexity and what allows it to explore the uncertain, shadowy zone where heroism intersects with abjection, moral integrity with crime. It also converts it into a masterpiece. The second example is even more curious than the first. It is The Leopard, Giuseppe Tomasi di Lampedusa's only novel, published posthumously just 4 years before the time of the hero. If I'm not mistaken, the habitual interpretation of this dazzling novel is the result of a misunderstanding, or simply a bad reading. If I'm not mistaken, the misunderstanding or the reading error has been, for the most part, provoked by the distorting influence of Luchino Visconti's marvelous film. Both the novel and the film tell of the vicissitudes of an old and aristocratic family from Sicily, in Italy, the Salina family, especially the vicissitudes of the prince Don Fabrizio and his nephew Tancredi, while they'll try to preserve their eternal privileged position in the midst of the gale provoked by the revolutionary struggles that will culminate in the unification of Italy. In Visconti's film, there is no doubt the instrument that fate offers Don Fabrizio so that the revolution will not change things and everything will stay as it is for him and his family is the marriage of his nephew Tancredi to Angelica, the daughter of Don Calogero, the prototype of the rising and rich revolutionary bourgeoisie with whom the noble and decadent Salina family must ally itself in order to survive. It is a marriage of interest, clearly, but most of all, a love match. Of course, how could Alain Delon, the actor who plays the part of Tancredi, not fall in love with Claudia Cardinale, the actress who plays Angelica, and also, at least in the film, I don't think anyone will dare to cast doubt on this, the most beautiful woman in the world? How could Tancredi not prefer Claudia Cardinale's joy and sensuality to the prudish and pious and pallid sadness of Lucilla Morlacchi, the actress who plays Concetta, Don Fabrizio's daughter, Tancredi's cousin, and the woman originally destined to be his wife? It's logical, right? It's inevitable, in fact. In Lampedusa's novel, however, things are nowhere near as clear as in the film. Nowhere. The film concludes in 1862 with Angelica's presentation to society as Tancredi's fiancée in the extremely long scene of the ball at the Ponte Leone Palace. You remember that. But the novel ends almost 40 years later with an epilogue where, unexpectedly, the whole tale takes on a new meaning. Don Fabrizio and Tancredi have been dead for some time. Angelica and Concetta, however, are both still alive. The first, Angelica, after having withstood an unhappy married life with Tancredi, and the second, having barely survived her lifelong spinsterhood, her bitterness over her frustrated love for her cousin, and unstoppable decline of the Salina family. One day, Angelica visits Concetta, accompanied by a childhood friend of Tancredi's, Senator Tassoni, who tells them that, in reality, his friend, Tancredi, adored Concetta, that he was always talking about her. This finally forces her, Concetta, to unintentionally reinterpret, thanks to an involuntary revelation, a particular long ago episode from her youth, and brings her to a conclusion as unexpected as it is devastating. In fact, her cousin had always loved her. It was she who had kept him at a distance with her pride and severity. Her whole life has been an error, in this as well. When Tassoni and Angelica leave Concetta, Tancredi's friend asked his widow, Angelica, if he'd said something wrong, because Concetta seemed upset. Angelica tells him no, and by way of explanation adds, quote, Concetta was madly in love with Tancredi, but he never took any notice of her, end of quote. Then the narrator, anxious to close every last gate of the story, as a good realist narrator, feels duty-bound to add, very important, this is very important, quote, and so a new spadeful of soil fell on the tumulus of truth. Everything is again clear then, although the clarity of the book lights up an opposite reality to that of the film. The truth is that Tancredi was in love with Concetta, and that by marrying Angelica, he sacrificed the love of his life on the altar of his and his family's interest. It's not that he doesn't also fall in love with Angelica. Undoubtedly, he does. But he does so fleetingly, the way his uncle could fall in love with the vulgar and frisky lovers he secretly visits at night in Palermo. Angelica must barely be, for Tancredi, a conceivable wife, while Concetta was the wife he needed. Quote, famous quote, if we want things to stay as they are, things will have to change, says the novel's most famous line. But it's often forgotten that the first person to speak of this line is not Don Fabrizio, but Tancredi. And it's Tancredi who is first to change everything so everything will stay the same. Also, the most important thing, the essential thing, the enduring love for his cousin Concetta, swapped for a fleeting passion and marriage to Angelica. In exchange for this sacrifice, Tancredi loses what he had, Concetta's happiness and love, and does not achieve what he has sought, to maintain the Salina family's preponderance, immersed in the book's epilogue in terminal ruin. Tancredi's failure is Don Fabrizio's failure, also Concetta's and Angelica's and the whole Salina family's. Added to the meticulous awareness of the human expiry that permeates the novel, this unanimous failure ends up endowing it with its overwhelming melancholy. But what about the blind spot? Where is the leopard's blind spot? The answer is simple. As we know now the novel, nowhere. As we know it nowadays, The Leopard is a novel without a blind spot. That said, if I had been with Lampedusa when he wrote the sentence where he clarifies without leaving room for doubt that Concheta was Tancredi's true love, again, and so a new spadeful of soil fell on the tumulus of truth, I would have shouted as if I were Vargas Llosa and as if he were Vargas Llosa and I Roger Calois. No, you don't know that. You don't know whether the one Tancredi truly loved was Concheta. End of quote. My quote. And if Lampedusa hadn't died before seeing his novel published, and I had been Giorgio Bassani, his editor at Feltrinelli, and had worked with him on the manuscript, I would have done everything possible and impossible to convince him to delete that comment. Because it's a mistake. It's not as grave an error as if at the end of the time of the hero, Vargas Llosa had made clear that it was the jaguar who killed the slave. Or if at the end of Don Quixote, Cervantes had revealed that in reality, Don Quixote, in fact, was never mad. But it's still an error. A mistake that might seem strange in a writer as great as Lampedusa, especially if before this excess of explicitness, we remember his crucial essay on Stendhal, where he distinguishes between implicit and explicit writers and praises the first and the implicit writers and abominates the second, the latter, the explicit writers. If we take a good look, however, the error is not so strange. And not just because it's not strange for writers to violate our own aesthetic principles, and not always to the detriment of our books, but also especially because in spite of the Leopard's greatness, its author was a novice writer who often has his narrator commit clumsy and detrimental interferences in his tale, interferences that, who knows, perhaps he would have deleted from the definitive text, especially if it had the good fortune to count on a good editor. The one I've mentioned is, without the slightest doubt, the most serious of all. Without it, there are as many reasons to think that, in fact, Concheta was Tancredi's authentic love as there are to think she wasn't. That this was just a senile fantasy of an old lady embittered by her unfulfilled life, and that in reality love and self-interest formed an alliance so that Tancredi would marry Angelica. Without that harmful, terrible phrase, the book's ambiguity would be perfect and its central question, a question that would only be posed in the epilogue but would have retrospectively dominated the book, would have been a romantic question, as corresponds to a romantic novel. Who was Tancredi's true love? With that superfluous phrase, the answer to the book's question would have been the quest for an answer, the question itself, the book itself. Or, to put it another way, without that phrase, the answer would have been only in the hands of the reader. It's what always happens with blind spot novels. Some will object to say that it doesn't just happen in them, but in any novel, or in any story, or simply in any literary work. It's true. A book doesn't exist by itself, but only insofar as someone reads it. A book without readers is no more than a pile of dead letters. And it's when readers open it and we begin to read that a daily magic operates and the letters revive, endowed with a new life. New and, of course, different in any case. After all, a book is just a score that each of us interprets in our own way. The better the score, the more and better interpretations it'll tolerate or encourage. That's why there are virtually as many Don Quixotes as there are readers of Don Quixote. Ultimately, the reader creates the book as much as the writer does, or even more, at least in the case of the best readers and the best books. That's what Paul Valéry believed. It's never the author who makes a masterpiece, he writes, Paul Valéry. The masterpiece owes its existence to the reader, to the quality of the reader. The reader with rigor, with subtlety, with slowness, with time and armed innocence. Only that reader can make a masterpiece. End of quote. Wonderful quote, in my opinion. All this is true, but it's not the whole truth. It's also true that to settle in the work and be able to create it hand to hand with the author and appropriate it, the reader needs the author to allow him some space. That space is ambiguity. And in order for the reader to be able to penetrate that space and deploy there the rigor, the subtlety, and armed innocence Valéry demands of him, the author should open a gap, a subtle entry point to the hermetism of his fictitious world, an entry point to the hermetism of his fictitious world. That gap is the blind spot. It could be said that while reading blind spot novels and stories, the reader's task consists of locating that spot through the labyrinth of clues the author has set out. Once he's located the gap, the reader should sneak in to get to the bottom of it fearlessly, like a speleologist into territories that only the novel or the short story can explore, forbidden to any other form of inspection. Of course, there are also cowardly or spineless or incompetent readers, lacking all the virtues of Valéry's reader. Readers who don't find the blind spot, or find it and don't recognize it, or prefer not recognize it, and therefore abandon, inept or apprehensive, the complexities, ambiguities, paradoxes, and ironies the author offers them. Readers who decide, for example, that Don Quixote is only crazy, that Moby Dick just represents evil, that Joseph K. is only innocent. They have a right to their opinions, of course, although with them they accept the simplification and impoverishment of the book, degrading the moral and intellectual adventure the author is offering them. I've often thought that a good writer is the opposite of a good politician. A good politician, in my opinion, is someone who confronts a complex problem, reduces it to its bare essentials, and solves it in the quickest way. That's a good politician for me. A good writer, on the other hand, is someone who confronts a complex problem and, instead of solving it, makes it even more complex. And a genius writer is one who creates a problem where none existed. Good politicians simplify our lives, and bad ones complicate them. And by complicating our lives, they impoverish them. While bad writers simplify life, and good ones complicate it. And by complicating our lives, they enrich them. That's why politicians tend to be such bad writers and writers such bad politicians. Cervantes complicates our life forever by posing in Don Quixote, in the most complex way possible, the insoluble problem of the insoluble contradiction between madness and sanity, as Melville posed in Moby Dick the insoluble problem of the insoluble contradiction between good and evil, and Kafka in The Trial, the insoluble problem of the insoluble contradiction between guilt and innocence. In their own ways, Hawthorne, Conrad, James, Lampedusa, and Vargas Llosa did the same in the books I've mentioned. It's what the great literature does. Complicate our lives by posing complex questions in the most complex way possible, raising irreducible paradoxes, forging enigmas with no solutions, or at least with no apparent solution, devising epistemological aporia. Ultimately, as Faulkner said, lighting a match in the middle of the absolute darkness that surrounds us. We might say that the match doesn't let us see anything, but that's not true. It lets us see the darkness. The blind spot pitches the intrepid reader As Baudelaire would put it, au bout de l'inconnu pour y trouver du nouveau, to the depths of the unknown to find something new. The blind spot seeks meaning where there doesn't seem to be any, in places at first glance invulnerable to meaning, or at least to a clear meaning, contradictions, ironies, and irreducible paradoxes, chasing some hitherto unheard of knowledge or even a revelation, or the imminence of a revelation, knowing it will perhaps never occur, even that it cannot occur. Borges observed, however, that an imminent revelation which does not occur is perhaps the aesthetic event. I would add that perhaps it's also that elusive, ambiguous, equivocal, contradictory, and essentially ironic event that we call literary truth. That truth that is not in the answer to a question, but in the quest for an answer, in the question itself, in the book itself. Blind spot novels and short stories are not the ones that contain ambiguities, contradictions, paradoxes, and ironies, because, of course, every good novel and all good short stories do. Blind spot novels and short stories are those that place ambiguity, contradiction, paradox, and irony in their very center, so their power irradiates throughout the whole text. The more ambiguous a work, the better it is, because it's more polysemic, because it leads to or admits more interpretations, and more meanings is able to embrace. We must not confuse, however, ambiguity with vagueness. Vagueness blocks meaning or dilutes it, while ambiguity triggers it, multiplying the interpretations of a text. Nothing contributes to making a novel or short story more ambiguous or more polysemic as much as the blind spot, that spot through which the novel or a story sees, that silence through which they are eloquent, that darkness through which they illuminate. Nothing contributes as much as a blind spot to priming a novel or story with meaning, to increasing the volume of meaning it's able to generate. Don Quixote, Moby Dick, and the Trial endure because, thanks in part to their central ambiguity, to their blind spot, they do not cease to resonate in us, provoking new and counterpoised interpretations. That's the guarantee of their greatness, of their heroic refusal to die. A work is eternal, writes Roland Barthes, not because it imposes a single meaning upon different men, but because it suggests different meanings to a single man. End of quote. That is in part thanks to their blind spots what the novels and short stories I've just been talking about have achieved. That's what, with maximum humility, but also with maximum ambition, mine aspire to. Thank you very much. I don't know, it's 55 minutes, maybe too much, right? I talk too much. Okay.
Well, when you were talking about the blind spot, two words kept on coming into my mind, which are El Túnel by Sabato and Emma Thun by Borges. And I was wondering if you also think those two words had that blind spot.
I have to think about it.
Yes. Well, my instinct says yes in the case of El Túnel, especially in the end, right? We don't know why Castel killed the woman. And Emma Thun, I don't know, Emma Thun.
Well, it's just...
Okay.
Yeah, so in Emma Thun, basically, we meet this lady, she wakes up one morning and...
Yes, I remember.
And then at the end, we kind of find out that the whole thing was a setup to pretend that she got raped by the woman who killed her. But then she's the only one who knows why her father actually committed suicide. She's the only one who knows that the father committed suicide. she's the only one who knows that she actually didn't get raped by the man.
Yes.
So there's no way we can actually distinguish whether Emma Thun is actually innocent or she is guilty. Because everyone around her in the short story takes her as innocent when actually she's a killer that set up the whole scenario.
That's for sure. She killed the man. She kills the guilty guy.
So, yeah, I don't know. I was just thinking about that. Whether there's a blind spot there or if Borges is trying to actually tell us whether, well, you know because you are reading that Emma is guilty, but everyone else around her, there's no way they would ever know.
Yes, but we know.
But we know.
We know. I mean, in the case of the El Sur, the South, we don't know if, to go back to Borges, we don't know if Dalman died in the hospital or if he dies fighting with the gaucho. We don't know. We don't know. In this case, we know. It's different, right? I mean, in this case, we know that she killed this guy. Why she killed him? It's true that the people around her. But anyway, yes. In this case, I wouldn't say that. But I have to think. I mean, I can think about other blind spot texts. For instance, I always think, but I need to go back to the text. I mean, I'm just suggesting one thing, and then, of course, there's plenty of people who can work on it, if it's possible to work on it. For example, in Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, you translate that? The Magic Mountain? It's called that in English? Okay, so in The Magic Mountain, there's the whole book is about the discussion, the big discussion between its two characters, Nafta and Settembrini, right? One, okay, that represent humanism and the new, something that is new and anti-humanism, right? And at the end of the novel, there is this duel. You remember the duel between them? And Settembrini, I don't remember exactly, but he tries to kill Nafta, and he doesn't get him, and then Nafta just needs to kill him. And what he does, if I remember well, bam, and that's it. He dies. He commits suicide. I should reread the book, but my impression is that there's a good example of why he does that. I mean, there's not a solution of the big discussion in between the two great visions of the world, right? Or for instance, The Portrait of a Lady by Henry James. Also, it's another example. At the end, we don't know why Isabel Archer returns with this bastard, who is her husband. And I think that there is also a central ambiguity in the book. There are many examples, maybe. But I don't think Emma Thun is one of them, right? I wouldn't say so. I mean, my instincts. But this night I'm going to go back and then I'll see. Okay.
Sorry, I was just going to ask, so it seemed more during your talk that the blind spot is to do with the plot, in terms of the action, what happened, something that we know or that we don't know. But the examples you've given just now seem a different kind of blind spot, and in fact one that I prefer, where it's to do with the ambiguity is to do with attitudes and feelings and complexities in motivation,
yes,
rather than in whether or not we know that somebody killed someone. That seems like a more fertile ground for the blind spot.
Fertile.
I'm
not sure it's more fertile. Yeah, but you're right. I talked about two, and we can maybe find another kind of blind spots. I talk about the conceptual blind spot and the narrative blind spot. The conceptual blind spot is Don Quixote or Bartleby, these characters that are that are completely contradictory, that are not clear, that are completely obscure, right? Like Don Quixote is one thing and the contrary, or that like Bartleby, or like right, the examples I put. And then there is the narrative blind spot, like in Kafka's. I wouldn't say that one is better than the other one. I wouldn't say that. It depends on the use of it. I mean, because in the case of Kafka or in the case of Vargas Llosa, or in the case of other narrative blind spots, can be very. I mean, it depends on the uses the author gives to them, right? Or in the case of Lampedusa's is that's yeah.
The Magic Mountain and the Portrait of a Lady, are those conceptual blind spots for you, or narrative?
I would say so, right? But you should reread these books, to see if there is really a blind spot. This is my idea. In the Magic Mountain and the Portrait of a Lady.
I'm just echoing this. I was thinking something similar. Like in some realist texts, there is an ambiguity in the central character. So we could think of Emma Bovary, like people around her, as being extremely lacking in lucidity. But we could also think of her as being the projection of Flaubert's hatred of reality, that she's right to dream of something better than the material world. She's a sort of failed tragic hero. Or if you think of Le Rouge et Noir, we never know who is Julien Sorel, because Stendhal manages to give him these two contradictory character traits of cunning and spontaneity. So usually in real life we don't meet people who are both cunning and spontaneous.
Are you sure?
Well, maybe that is crude what I say, but the spontaneity of Julien is a kind of recklessness.
Yes.
So he does things that are self-destructive. And at other times he's very calculating. And Stendhal convinces us that this is possible. But at the end, we don't know, who he is. And we could also say we don't know why he kills Madame de Renan, but that is, in a way, just a superficial aspect of it. I just wonder, could you say there would be a third kind of blind spot, which is psychological? Or just
yes.
Which is less conceptually explicit than talking about it?
Yes. But this is what I'm trying to say is a hypothesis, right? There's some novels who work like that. I'm not saying that the only good novels are blind spot novels, first of all. And I'm not saying that, of course, there's novels without blind spots that have ambiguous characters. Of course, I mean, there's no novel without ambiguity. All characters in Dostoevsky, in the great novels, and of course they are contradictory and they are. But the difference is that, as I see it, is that this ambiguity is the core of the book, the center of the book. I mean, the whole book revolves around this central, essential contradiction, ambiguity, right? So it's different, right? I don't know, but of course we can think of other examples. But the complexity of a character, like Julien, like Raskolnikov, it's not what I would call a blind spot, right? The complexity is always there. It's supposed to be there. And there's a hypothesis that I'm not sure. I'm not sure if this is something. Spontaneously, I would say that this is not, the blind spot is not something that the realist novel has as a characteristic, right? And that's why Lampedusa's the Leopard and the Time of the Hero are so interesting, because in both cases, Vargas Llosa is the only case in which Vargas Llosa wants to be a realist writer, right? That's what he wants to be. And I must say that this has explained this anecdote by what is it about the French critic after I wrote something on it. I mean, he wasn't really conscious of that and of the importance of that, I think. Because his idea of the novel is like Flaubert's, like Lampedusa, closed, absolutely closed. Everything is closed. It's a world, hermetic, it's a world in which the reader plunges. So we must close it so that the reader can live it, all the lives and all the passions and everything. And the blind spot, it's contradictory with that, because it opens the book in a sense, right? So, but maybe not. I don't know. It's a hypothesis. But I don't see the blind spot in Madame Bovary, for example. I mean, it's not enough to say that Madame Bovary, as you say, you're right. It's it's at the same time frivolous and heroic, and yeah, it's true. As Raskolnikov is at the same time, this kind of, for me, it's not enough. But maybe yes. I don't know.
If the blind spot depends on perspectivism, like that there's no closure.
Yes.
Well, there is perspectivism also in Flaubert. So Nabokov talks about the goodness of Charles Bovary, and if one thinks of that, this ironic encounter between Charles and Rodolphe at the end, where Charles is in his goodness totally devastated by Emma's death, in spite of all that she did against him, and Rodolphe sees him and thinks, what a ridiculous man.
Yes.
So this is a realist perspective, but it's not enough then for you to create this real ambiguity.
Yes. It's not the same thing. It's another effect. I'm not saying that Madame Bovary is a bad novel. I'm saying Madame Bovary is an enormous novel, right? And I think it's another effect. It's another way of working, right? It's another way of working. It's another aesthetic. It's another thing. Yes.
Could you push something like that line further with the leopard? I mean, the characters in the leopard are mostly not that interesting. Different.
Not that interesting.
No. And perhaps Selina is. There's less so. And the dilemma you posed at the end as being the difficult thing to resolve seems to me to be outweighed throughout the book by the stance which Lampedusa adopts towards his creation, in that the ambiguity is really what does he make of this world. He keeps offering it to us as something which might be realistic, but it also is a world which seems to both attract him and repel him, and that runs through the whole book, so that we, as readers, are caught constantly in a dilemma of where to situate the book and where to situate the author in relation to his creation. And that seems to me to be a structural blind spot, a textural blind spot that I find interesting. But I'm not sure that I really care about Concetta and Tancredi.
Oh, I care a lot. You don't. You don't care about them? That's strange for me. I mean, for me they're very, very. I would almost say the novels of characters. I would say. I mean, I care a lot about them. Extraordinarily about Concetta, about Tancredi, about, of course, the Prince, about lots of people in there. It's a very strange novel for me. It's a very strange novel. You agree with me? I mean, when I read for the first time this novel, when I was young and I wanted to be a postmodernist, blah, 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 I thought it was, old-fashioned and blah, and all this. But when you reread the book, it's extraordinary. And I think that yes, the point of if Tancredi was in love with his cousin or with Angelica, it's extremely important because it embodies all the real dilemma of the book. which is that phrase. We need to change something so that everything stays the same. And this is the real thing. I mean, we're talking about that in this book, right? How the struggle of this family, especially Don Fabrizio, but also Tancredi, to stay as they are, the eternity of this nobility that has been always the same, right? And so through this, I agree with you in the fact that this anecdote, it's an anecdote. In fact, it's not important, in fact, was he in love or not? It's through this anecdote that the big subject of the book arrives to us. That's what I think. Through this tiny anecdote, that's simple as that, right? That's what I call the blind spot. Something apparently not important. I mean, who killed the slave? Who cares about that? I mean, it's just the plot. It's not important. But through this anecdote, the novel deploys a very complex moral problem, right? In The City and the Dogs, or in this anecdotal thing. It was in love or was in love, which is totally non-important in the book. I mean, who cares about the plot? I agree with you. But through this anecdote, all the complexities of the book display. The central complexity of the book is in this tiny thing. Or for example, in Kafka's, right? We're talking about the blind spot, the narrative blind spot. Who cares about if he's guilty or is not guilty? But it is through that Kafka, deploys all the enormous complexity of, the relationship with the law and this and that, right? And the guilty and the innocent and all the big problems of the book. So that's what I think, and I care a lot about the characters in the.
I do about Kafka. I agree. But,
No. I care a lot about the Leopard's characters too. A lot.
I care about Salina.
Yes.
I'm not sure about the others.
I care, a lot, and especially about Conchetta. That was surprising for me when I discovered that sentence. I said, well, we don't need that sentence, etc. And I reread the book. I talked to Italian people, and they told me, well, nobody wrote about that. I mean, it's not important. And that's very strange. I think that's the film who has changed the interpretation of the book. And that was very important. You should reread that. You will see that this is very important. This is really, really important. It's the epilogue. Everything changes. It's the moment when it is very important, this epilogue.
Yes, but the last image is of the dog.
Yes, exactly, the dog, exactly. We remember very well, yes. The last image, yeah. I think it's an incredibly good novel. It is very, very, very good. And old-fashioned, but at the same time really modern, right? And all the melancholy is in there, in this stupid anecdote. I mean, all have failed. I mean, everything is a total disaster. The family, nothing didn't work. Nothing did work, right? Okay.
Just one echo. Do you think tone is important for these blind spot novels? As like the tone of the narrator, like in Kafka's weird tone, is that something that is like a criterion? Because the texts you talk about are extremely different in tone.
I think the tones are really different, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's not like something that runs through it. So.
No, I don't see that. Do you see that?
No, it's more like, I think what you were saying to do with the tone a little bit. Because if the narrator is distant, it sort of creates a certain kind of ironic tone in the text. But if you, in a sense, look at what the text is about, well, then the tone in a way falls away.
Mm-hmm. But I insist, it's not always it's not always it's not always a plot problem. I mean,
No.
okay,
No, in Cercas, of course, it has to do with.
yes, it has not to do with that. It's not always a narrative plot. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. And maybe there are more kind of what I call blind spots. For me, essentially, it is an instrument to put irony, ambiguity in the center of the novel. If you remember, Lukács talked about this, the novel as essentially, in the theory of the novel, the first Lukács, about this, the essence of the novel being the irony, right? So that's what I'm trying to. That's what I'm trying to say. And the blind spot is an instrument that certain novels use to do that, to get that. Am I trying to construct a tradition for myself? Maybe, but that's what it is, right? We must look into the tradition to see what's in there, because the new is always in the tradition. If not, it's not good. There's this sentence by a Spanish, let's say, philosopher called Eugenio Dors, who says, what is not tradition is plagiarism. Plagiarism? Something like that? Plagiarism, yes. So we must look there, what is there, and reread the tradition in order to create as a tradition, to found fathers and grandfathers and things like that. Good ones.
Yeah. Do you think the blind spot is something characteristic of the narrative, of the Argentinian narrative of the 20th century, particularly of that narrative which is connected to the fantasy? I'm thinking of Borges as well, but Julio Cortázar, I mean, I'm thinking of Casa Tomada, or in Continuidad de los Parques, or also in La Isla Melodía, you know, when they have this character and he finds himself at the end of the story. You know?
Yes. I don't know if it's a character. I don't think that it's Argentinian, very characteristic from Argentinian narrative. I think it's characteristic from good narrative. Yes. Well, your examples are perfect. All of them, right?
They all have like the irony at the end.
Yes, absolutely.
Not fulfilling his own life. I mean,
yes.
The character, Juan Dalman, he died because he's not reading the 1001 Night. So it's the play of not doing things that kills them.
Yes, but Cortázar is a perfect example. The examples you put were perfect. Yeah. Casa Tomada, you don't know what's happening there. Who's invading the house and
on the other side of the door.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. But I don't think that this is specifically from Argentina, right? I think it's universal.
But it seems to me that one of the consequences of your point of view or your interpretation of the novel is that the right attitude of the good reader is that of perplexity. But the good reader would be the person that is perplexed and don't try to resolve, to eliminate this perplexity. Probably you know that the Spanish philosopher Javier has a book titled Desde la Perplejidad, from the perplexity.
Mm-hmm.
It's a remembrance of the title of the Jewish philosopher Avento Fire, the guide for perplexed.
Mm-hmm.
And there, Javier Muguerza said that the perplexed person is not a person that has a doubt or doesn't know what to do. It's the person that believes simultaneously in two contradictory ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And cannot resolve the dilemma, because every position has very good reason, and it's impossible to decide. So the perplexed cannot go out the perplexity usually, and
he recommends this attitude as a philosophical attitude. I agree with him. Probably it's also a good attitude for the reader, for the good reader.
It's probable, yeah. Yeah. I was thinking, well, of the beginning of the Crack Up by Scott Fitzgerald, where he says something similar. He says I don't know how to say, we know that we are in front of a great intelligence when this intelligence can manage two contradictory thinking and go on living, right? Without paralyzing. And finally, it's a form to accept complexity, right? To accept complexity, that life is not one thing, or things are not one thing, can be, right? That's what I think. Why I think that it was so important. I mean, this is the great invention by Cervantes, right? Yesterday we were talking about, last night with Edwin Williamson, about the fact that, it's true that Spanish-speaking world learned the lesson of Cervantes 3 centuries after the book was published. But the world learned the lesson, began to learn the lesson 1 century after that, with Sterne and Fielding, etc. here, right? So it is incredible. I mean, that's a total revolution. The fact that two things can be the same thing. That the fact that this complexity, right? It's astonishing. And to put this in the center as an instrument of knowledge, maybe similar to what Muguerza says, right? It is an instrument of knowledge. It is not something, no, it is an instrument of knowledge. We know with that, right? Life, it's more complex with that. I was thinking about, yes. That's moral life, right? Always contradictory, always. I have to think about one thing. I'll think about, another question, because there's one thing that I want to, I think it's a total revolution. And there's the first day somebody asked me that question, why in Spain nobody learned this lesson and you British stole as novel, especially you British and some French. No, it's true. I mean, why that? And the answer, it's obvious. In Spain, in the 17th century and 18th century, there was, beginning, end of 16th century, each year more a closed society, a dogmatic society, with just one truth, right? The church, the altar, and the crown, right? The absolute monarchy and the dogma of the church. And in this world where there is only one truth, there can only be this closed world, nobody could understand that. How can you understand that? It's dangerous, of course. It's dangerous if somebody is not true. Can be another thing. It's dangerous. You are touching the essence of the system, right? Which is there is only one truth. And irony says no, there's not just one truth. But things can be different, right? And science also is the same in the sense that truth is always provisional, right? This is truth, but then this is not truth, and then we need another truth, and etc., right? And that's why I think, and why in England, in Great Britain, people more than one century after Cervantes understood what Cervantes was trying to say. Because in England, in Great Britain, in Europe, in France, the modernity was, science and enlightenment and everything, right? So that's why it's so decisive. And that's why everything we can say about the genius of these men, it's incredible. It's not, it's incredible.
There is a good example that supports what you said. The first book in the contemporary Spanish philosophy is La Meditación del Quijote de José Ortega y Gasset. And it's the book that offered to the Spanish people the solution to the problem. The solution is Europe. The solution is science. Against Unamuno.
Yeah.
In my opinion, Unamuno belongs to the old tradition.
Yes.
And the first modern contemporary philosopher is José Ortega y Gasset, and his first book is Meditación del Quijote, Meditation on Quijote.
And discussing perspectivism and not one truth. That's very interesting. That's very interesting. That's very interesting. I don't think that's why I don't think, sorry to say that, but that not even in the 19th century, Spanish novelists understood Quixote, Galdós and all this. It was these Latin American novelists who understood, with Borges and etc. and Vargas Llosa. Yes, that's what I think, and I think that's true. How can you understand a book like that in a very closed, claustrophobic Spain? Like, it's impossible. I mean, no way. It was a national book, funny book, important book, but nobody could understand that. It was. So give us back the novel, you English people. Okay. Thank you very much.